co-host Matt, so extra grace, please. We are wrapping up our story series, and we've just had a really great July. We got to hear all sorts of stories from Westwood attenders and community members, and we have heard everything from stories about brokenness and loss and finding God in that, to stories about freedom from addiction, battles internally and externally, and we heard a story last week about some radical obedience that was happening in a family here in St. Cloud. And today, we get to hear a story from Steve Black about meeting God in everyday life. And so I figure if previous weeks haven't resonated with you, today should hit home, because we all have ordinary lives. We all have lives of, sometimes it's monotonous, sometimes it's exciting, sometimes it's sad, but we all go through that in life. And so hopefully you'll hear something that you can resonate with today. The Bible shares some stories about everyday life, but sometimes I feel like I wish there were more stories in there about everyday life. The Bible talks about how Noah was in the ark for like a year, and it only takes up maybe like a chapter or a chapter and a half. And I'm like, oh, I'd love to know more. Like, what happened in that ark for that year? Like, was the family like, pretty graceful with each other? Was there arguments? What did they eat? Did anyone get seasick? Was anyone tired or like grumbly about it, or not? Also, like the story of Jesus, like we go from like him being 12 years old in the temple and people being like, oh, this guy's really great. And he's teaching the teachers in the temple when he's 12. And then we hear from him again when he's like in his 30s. And so there's just a huge gap where I'm like, oh, I'd love to know more about Jesus. And what was his life like then? What was he doing during that time? But God didn't give us that. And so sometimes we just are kind of left wondering. And maybe your story's the same, where it's like every day isn't like a riveting movie. It's not like, oh, today was an epic day. Sometimes you just brush your teeth and get your food on the table, and it was like, woo, it's a good day. No, just me? All right. I like the story in Acts where it talks about Peter and John, and the religious leaders are talking to Peter and John, and they had just healed a man. And so they're trying to get to the bottom of this, and they interview him, and they speak with confidence and conviction. And the religious leaders are like, they realized that they were just ordinary, unschooled men. And they took note that they had been with Jesus. And I was like, what a great testimony. Like, what an awesome thing to be said about someone. Like, I would love to be like, she doesn't have a lot going on. But I took note that she was with Jesus, and he worked through her. And like, just that's so cool to think that God worked through ordinary, unschooled men to reach all of us here today. Like, he worked through 12 disciples who, by all means were just regular Joes, and he reached the world with them. And so I think that sometimes we can too easily be like, I don't know what I have. I love those magazines where they have story or pictures of celebrities like buying milk. Like Brad Pitt's like buying milk, and it's like, stars, they're just like us. And it's like, I suppose that's true. Or like some kids like throwing a temper tantrum, it's like, look, their kid has a temper tantrum too. Like, yeah, take that, stars. But they're just like us, right? And it's hard, sometimes you have to be reminded that like the people around us are just like us. And I think sometimes even ministry staff, sometimes we can elevate and be like, oh, they're very spiritual, they're very like, and I know like when I first started coming here and I wasn't very connected, I got a call from Brian Freeberg, who was the worship director at this time, and he just left me like some vague message like, hey Katie, can you give me a call back? I'll talk to you later. And I didn't know him, and I didn't know really anybody on staff, and I was kind of newer to church, and I was like, why is a minister calling me? Is it like a spiritual intervention? Like, do they know something that I don't know? Are they going to call something out? I just had no idea, and I called back, and he was like, hey, do you and your family want to get together for dinner? Sure. And it was like a wake up, and then like, we hung out with them, and they were just so normal. And I mean, it's true for the pastors here and the ministers here. And I feel like sometimes you guys get to come on Sunday, and you get to see people serve out of their gifts. Like Brian Feldman, amen, has a gift for music. And like we get to enjoy that and watch him live through that. And we're like, yeah, like man, Brian is so gifted. God really uses him. But I will say that we on staff celebrate just as much when all y'all use your gifts and we really say, man, did you see how that person served? Man, they just served with the strength of the Lord. Man, did you see how she encouraged? Man, I wish I could be an encourager like that. That's just not my gift. But that's her gift. And that's awesome that she uses it in this church. And so that's what Westwood is it's not a building. It's all of us here. It's all of us who come here and exist together and have gifts, and we're serving to build this place up. 1 Peter 2:4 says, "You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. And you," now he's just writing a letter, so it's not like to one person. "You are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. What's more is you are his holy priests." And so you are a living stone with Christ as the cornerstone. He's the base, he's got all the strength, he carries all the weight. But you are a living stone that's being built up into the temple of Jesus. And so how are you living your stone today? Like, how are you building this stone up? And what gifts are you using to serve him? Because I can tell you, every day matters. Our everyday lives are important, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it. Even when I was thinking yesterday about like what I wanted to say, what order, whatever, my kids were, being loud and crazy. We got a drop-in visitor, which we live in the country, we never get drop-in visitors. We get people coming to visit, and I'm like, hey everybody, come on. I'm trying to think about everyday life here. We don't have time to do everyday life. I'm busy thinking about it. Come on, we're good here. Wake up! Everyday life is all around you. And that was like a wake up for me. It was like, oh wait, it's in these moments that I get to strengthen my faithfulness for those mountaintop experiences. For those times when I'm like, oh man, I felt like God really used me today. Like, glory to God, that was awesome. Or those valleys where you're like, man, life right now is rough. And I am just in a pit. But it's in those faithful everyday motions where we can kind of get to the top and use what we've poured into. And so just little drops at a time. It's hard. Yeah. So we get to welcome Steve Black up here, and he gets to teach us a little bit about what God has meant in him for everyone. So thank you for being here.
So 2 services in a row, she has intentionally used the phrase, all y'all. Which I'm from North Carolina, and I'm convinced she did that just to make me feel a little more at ease up here. I'm getting used to the oofdas, but the all y'alls really do help. So growing up though, I grew up in central Indiana, in a small farming community. I see a fist pumping back there. We have a Hoosier? Excellent, even more comfortable. So, in a small farming community, small town church that had been around for a very long time, and every spring, the church would prepare the kids to do the entire Easter service. So we did it, soup to nuts, the whole thing. We'd do the worship, we'd pick the songs, we would do the offering, we would hand out the bulletins, even preach the sermon. And I remember at 9 years old, the teacher coming in saying, all right, it's time for everybody to sign up for what they're going to do. Now, who would like to preach? My hand could not have gone up any faster. I have never met a microphone I didn't like in my life, and that was no exception. I love the idea of being up here with, honestly, egocentrically, attention on me. It's all about me. And so as a 9-year-old, I think all 9-year-olds are like this, that would sound like a really great thing. And so I preached my first sermon at 9 years old. And after that, I remember the church, the people in the church coming up to me and saying, well, you have a gift. When you talk, people listen. You have leadership. You have a speaking ability, a comfort. You should be a pastor. Now, at the time, that sounded like a horrible idea because I thought that meant that I had to be celibate and couldn't get married for the rest of my life. Pastors and priests are 2 different things, and so my mom helped me through that. But even after that, every year I would raise my hand, every year I would give the Easter message at our church. And every year, people would come up and say the same thing. You have a gift, you have an ability, you have leadership, you have teaching capabilities. You should be a pastor. And what was hardwired into my mind is if you have these gifts, this is where those gifts should play out. If you really want to honor God with your gifts, you need to be up here. But there was one problem. I didn't know Jesus. I heard stories about him, but really our church, a lot of the stories were about being moral. And the idea that I had growing up was don't drink, don't do drugs, don't have sex, and don't date girls who do. And if you did that, you would have a successful childhood. But we know that a Christian life, Jesus, is much more than that, isn't it? But I didn't know that. So all of a sudden in college, I started doing all those things that I was told not to do, and I fell out of this idea that God must not love me. And that was the way I lived my life until August 3rd, 1996. After, on the back end of making some really terrible life decisions, sitting on the back of my dad's brown Ford pickup truck on the tailgate, looking up into the stars and saying, I don't know who you are, but I am making a mess of my life. So I need you to take over. And I need you to show me what truth is. Who are you? And I spent the next 4 years really seeking out God, and I came to a loving and passionate relationship with Jesus Christ. And he was faithful. He brought me then into graduate school to become a physical therapist. And I entered into school, and in my class were 3 other men who were in the exact same place I was. And we were all trying to figure out what this life looked like, what it meant to follow Jesus. And thankfully, God did a great work. And so in grad school, I'm learning technically how to do a job, how to be a physical therapist. I'm spending a lot of money on school to do this, but at the same time, he was using us to build a ministry. And we started ministering to our peers, to our fellow college students and graduate students. By the time we left, we had a ministry of over 150 college and graduate kids, dozens of whom had given their life to Jesus Christ. So here I was, learning how to be a PT, but I was also seeing God work through ministry. And I was that thing that had been poured into me as a child, being up here, being at the pulpit, teaching, preaching, doing ministry. I was starting to get irritated by school because school was getting in the way of ministry. But I had a lot of student loans racking up, and I didn't feel like going to seminary and racking up another 100,000 student loans was a very good idea. So I begrudgingly got a job as a physical therapist. But the same thing happened. I got involved in a ministry, the ministry started growing, people were coming to a faith in Jesus Christ, and I started getting irritated with my job. Job, work, life is getting in the way of ministry. If I could just figure out a way to get rid of the work so that I could really minister to people, that would be success. But it wasn't happening. And so this tension started growing where I just started resenting work. Until 2006. And in 2006, 5 years after I had entered the PT field, I was given the keys to an outpatient rehab clinic, and I was able to hire my first employee. Her name was Janet. And Janet was a really angry woman. And I thought my career as a manager just ended before it even began because I did a very poor job of my first hire. Within the first month, she told me, without question, she had a struggle and a challenge with male authority figures, and that she detested Christians. All right, let's see how this goes. So, but God had a purpose. He had an intention there, and he had a reason for Janet being there, and he had a reason, I would say, more in my life. He started pushing me to care for Janet in the workplace. So she, within the first year, probably gave me on 6 different occasions very good reason to end her employment with us. But God wouldn't let me. And he kept pushing me to minister to her, to listen to her, to talk with her through tears and anger and relaying her story in years and years of abuse from men. And eventually, after a year and a half, I got to see her give her life to Jesus Christ. And that completely altered how I viewed ministry. Because all of a sudden, I wasn't ministering from up here. I was ministering the work. Every day, I was listening, I was walking with her, and ministry started to happen. And this just altered how I saw what ministry really was. I want to share with you 2 verses that really came to light during this season. 1 Corinthians 10:31. If you've been around church circles for any period of time, this is a very familiar one to you. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. It didn't say whether you are teaching or preaching from the pulpit. It uses the most basic, foundational things that we do every day. We have all ate and drank today. And we can do that for the glory of God. The second one like it is James 1:27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Again, it wasn't up here. It was finding the least of these, those who are in need, and going to them and entering into their suffering and their affliction with them. That is religion that is pure and undefiled. All of a sudden, my world was being turned upside down. These things I had thought about ministry from 9 years old all the way up were just being torn apart. As I was going through this transformation, God was doing this work in me. I got married to my wife, Meredith, and that was a glorious thing. And then right at that time, 2 other decisions we made as a couple really shifted how we thought about ministry as a whole. First, I was offered a job, and I accepted a job at a VA, Veterans Affairs Hospital in Indianapolis. So this is a federal agency, right? Separation of church and state. Can't allow God to come into the workplace. And so that was one thing that happened. Number 2 was that we were asked to pastor a church. So we were a part of a very large church. They were planting a church in northeastern Indianapolis, and they needed people to go serve this community out there. So we, along with 2 other couples, started pastoring a church. So I was working full-time in a federal agency, and I was working as a pastor, preparing church, preaching 1 to 2 times a month, every single month. And so this tension started to occur in me because I loved being up here. I loved teaching. I loved preaching. I loved leadership and being a part of growing this group of people that are pursuing God. But also these lessons I learned with Janet and through Janet were starting to come into my new job. And I was starting to see how I worked with employees with grace and with love and patience. Where typically people would react, I would patiently respond. And only by the grace of God, something was happening in the people around me, in the workforce. People all the way up in executive administration, I could see their lives changing because of things God was doing through me. And then something else happened. So the tension is occurring. Is ministry here or is it out there? We, at the time, we had our first child, Nora. She was about 1 year old. We lived kind of on the edge of a really shady part of town. It was probably okay to live in when I was a single male, but not married and with a 1 year old. And so we were living there. When I would go to work every day, my wife, Meredith, would start walking through the neighborhoods with Nora just to get her to fall asleep. And in doing so, started building relationships with the people around us. Started getting to know our neighbors. Some of them with really troubled lives, a lot of challenges. Started building relationships, started caring for them, loving them, going to where they are. And then one event occurred that changed everything. My wife was going out with some friends one night, but she wasn't leaving for a few more minutes. I was tired. Nora was already asleep. I went into our bedroom. I fell asleep. All of a sudden, I woke up suddenly because I heard a huge crash downstairs. And I thought maybe she had fallen. I thought maybe something was broken. And so I ran down on the landing of our stairs just in time to see 2 young men taking the TV off our wall. We were being robbed. And it's like in that moment, if you've ever been robbed, you're just like paralyzed. It's like, what just happened? And so I yelled some things that I should not say from the pulpit. And they ran out of the house, dropping the TV. And everything was okay. Thank God, everything was okay. Nora was okay. She slept through the whole thing. I was okay. Police came, worked through it. Now here was the part that changed everything. What we found out the next week, one of those 2 men was our next door neighbor. Now, if you've met my wife, she is a mama bear to the hilt. Don't mess with her cups, or you'll see the wrath. But the wrath didn't come out. Instead, she went over to their house and started building a relationship with this young man. First time she went over, she reminded me of this between services, because wives always have to make sure that the pastor-teacher gets it right. She said, remember, I took Gatorade and candy bars over the first time I went. That's what she did. Took a couple Snickers and Gatorade and said, let's talk. She just started loving on him, talking with him, sharing him, and eventually he asked for forgiveness. She gladly gave it. And then she gave him a Bible with his name on it. She started loving on this young man next to us. And for us, again, ministry was changing. We were ministering through our lives, day to day, house to house, in our neighborhood. God was working through me in the workplace. And what had been the case for years prior, where life and work was getting in the way of doing ministry, suddenly all the preparation for Sunday morning, all the work and running this church was getting in the way of ministry. Everything changed. And at that point, God gave me an opportunity to step into executive leadership within the VA down in North Carolina. And I had to make a decision. Where was ministry going to occur? Was it going to be up here? Or was it going to be out there? I want to share another verse with you. 1 Corinthians 3:9. One of my favorite verses in the Bible. For we are God's fellow workers. There's some pretty important things that are said right there. If He is at work, that means He didn't just leave us here. He didn't step off somewhere, create all this, step off, leave us here to just go at it on our own. He's living and active. He's doing things right now in this room, today, in our lives, the lives of people around us. He is living and active and at work in our lives. Not only that, but secondly, what does He call us to be? To be a fellow worker, to link arms with Him. He's not this harsh manager, taskmaster, sitting over us, lording over us, saying, do this, go there, do that. He wants us to come in and link arms with Him, to be a fellow worker. You are a fellow worker with the God of the universe. I was a fellow worker with the God of the universe. And for me, when that reality sunk in, that meant that I could step out of pastoral ministry and into the hospital administration, and I could still do His work. And so that's what we did. We left to go to North Carolina, left all of our friends, left our family, everything we had ever known, because we believed we were called to be missionaries. We knew that if God had not come and totally reclaimed this earth, if He had not returned and brought heaven fully to earth yet, then that meant that we were not home yet. And that means wherever we went, we were on mission. And so we went to North Carolina with a very different mindset. And that is that we are missionaries. And that meant that when we went to Pomodoro's Pizza, we were missionaries to our servers and to the owner. When I went into the workplace every day, every meeting, every committee, every interaction, I was on mission. We were on mission together. We were ministering through daily lives. And that meant a year and a half ago, when I was given the opportunity to become the CEO of this hospital here, it wasn't just about a job. It was we felt called to be missionaries to St. Cloud. And that's what got us here, is we are on mission. Our lives, every day, on mission. Now, we're no different from you. Our story is your story. But what we've realized is that ministry doesn't always have to happen from here, not from the pulpit, but in the narthex. Does anybody know what a narthex is? Okay, so you used to be Lutheran, I'm assuming, because that's, growing up, my church was part Lutheran, how it started, and the narthex was that area that the pastor went to after he got done preaching a sermon, and he would stand there and shake hands with every single person that left. Eugene Peterson, who wrote the message, says that's where ministry really starts. Because I will tell you, preaching hundreds of sermons myself, that if you leave a service as a pastor, as a teacher, and you hit one or two people, that was a good day. Because everybody is so different. It's hard to create a message that hits everybody square between the eyes. But out there, we have an impact. You have an impact. See, ministry happens around donut holes. Ministry happens over in the barn. Ministry happens as we pick up our kids from uptown and downtown. Ministry happens in our small groups, at Mr. Twisty, at hockey games, at swim lessons, at Jack Splash. No longer do we believe that ministry only can happen here, but true, eternal impact happens in day-to-day life. So what does that look like? You know, so many good books have been written on this topic. Many, the smarter, wiser people than myself can tell you how to do this right. But my wife and I feel like we have a couple lessons that have come from our life that we wanted to share with you today. Number one, we're going to look at a verse here, 1 Corinthians 15:58. Number one, commit your ways to the Lord. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in what? Let's try that again. Your labor is not in vain. If you commit your ways to the Lord, it will never be in vain. Who out there had at least one day last week that just didn't go quite right? Okay. The rest of you have broken arms or you're liars, one of the two. But we'll address that in another sermon. That's all right. The fact is, life never goes quite how we want it to, does it? It just doesn't, because we live in a broken and fallen world, and we can have plans and ideas about how it should look, but life just happens. But here's the promise that is in this verse, is that when we are steadfast in the Lord, when we commit our ways to Him, it will never be in vain. Life, God can use you in life every day. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. You can work at the bank. You can be a software programmer. You can be a custodian. You can be a healthcare administrator of all things. And God can still use you every day. But this is the key. Commit your life to Him. Commit your ways to Him. Because if we don't, then what is it? It is in vain. But under Him, it's never in vain. It gives us great encouragement for day-to-day life. So number one, commit your ways to the Lord. Number two, be faithful. You know, we live in a day and age where faithfulness, we just don't see it a whole lot. Because of Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, ones that I'm not even aware of, we can unfriend people. We can unlike them. We can remove their comments if they disagree with us, if we disagree with them. It's so easy to chop off relationship anymore. Faithfulness, which is a godly concept, is rare nowadays. But faithfulness is what sets us apart. When we as believers choose to be faithful to our neighbor, to our friends, to our family, even through disagreement, to our co-workers, it has an impact. So I share a short story with you. My mom and dad, when they got married back in 1971, Dad had just come back from Vietnam. And he was in Vietnam. He saw the very worst of what war had to offer. Things that no human being should ever have to go through. So he came back pretty closed off. Unfortunately, as a child, he also saw the worst of what religion had to offer. Grew up in a religion where you will be a Christian whether you like it or not. And if I remember right, I don't believe I'm making this up, was literally dunked in the baptismal 3 times to make sure it took. He tells the story. So when they got married, my mom wanted to raise us in a Christian family, in the church. But Dad wanted nothing to do with it. He wouldn't. He would go on Easter, he'd go on Christmas, just because that's the thing to do, but had no desire to be involved in the church. So what did my mom do? She prayed. She prayed every day. Every single day. For 35 years. Until God brought a pastor to our little church that connected with my dad. Knew how to love him. Knew how to engage in relationship. Would go up to the bar, sit in his woodworking shop, and just talk about life, sharing the things that he liked. And after 35 years, my dad started going to church. Now here's the thing I learned. That was really it. It wasn't that he didn't have a relationship with God. He actually had a really deep relationship with God. He just didn't have a deep relationship with church. But because of her faithfulness, just sitting beside him, walking with him, loving him, never pushing him, but praying for him, God did a work in his life. Now, he passed away last fall, but I will tell you, over the last 10 years, I knew about that man's walk with Jesus Christ. It was because of the faithfulness of a wife. Commit your way to the Lord. Be faithful. Number 3, and this wraps up our series. Share your story. You have a story that matters. Our stories matter. As I shared, I really don't have a special story. I don't have a story there's nothing really exciting or special about it. I didn't lose my best friend and spouse to cancer. I didn't lose a good friend on the battlefield. I didn't overcome drug addiction. And I didn't start a ministry reaching out to the least of these in St. Cloud. Truly, I'm just a guy, and there's really nothing special about my story. But here's the deal. My story matters, and your story matters. See, it's the individual story that connects people to the greater story of God, and a loving God that came to be with his people, to draw people nearer to him. Your story matters. I want to share one final verse with you, Acts 13:36. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid with his fathers and saw corruption. One of my favorite verses in the whole Bible, because it tells me I have a purpose. I have a purpose in this generation. You have a purpose in this generation. And part of that purpose is to tell your story. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, by definition, there was a way you were, God came in, and now there's a way you are. And that's different. That's a story worth telling. Do you know that every year in the Jewish communities during Pentecost, so Pentecost, right, is like the penultimate celebration and moment in the entire Jewish history when Moses goes up on the mountain, interacts with God, he's given the 10 Commandments. The glory of God is so powerful on him when he comes down the mountain that people can't even look at him. When they celebrate this just amazing moment in the Jewish history, do you know what book they read in the Old Testament? The book of Ruth. Now, why do they do that? Because Ruth is about just somebody. She was a nobody. She was a Moabite. She had no particular purpose or cause or reason within the Jewish culture, within the Israelite community. She was just an outsider. But God brought her in. A man, Boaz, redeemed her, brought her into the Jewish community. She ends up being in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And for the Jews, in the lineage of David. They tell the story of Ruth to help you and I and other people connect our personal story to the bigger story. As Katie was sharing, you have these massive, big stories in the Bible, and sometimes they're so hard to connect to. But what God wants us to realize is that your story connects people to God's story. I want to end with a story, or a quote from Eugene Peterson, who speaks very well about how to do pastoral work. And he says this about our stories. The announcement from the pulpit in church every Sunday usually has been clear enough. It's God's will to save every person, to incorporate each created man and woman into the people of God, to graft each private history into the stock of salvation history. But many disqualify themselves, supposing that their individual experience or unique circumstances exempt them from the general truth. Guilt or willfulness or accident makes a loophole, and they assume that what is true for everyone is not true for them. They are left out. They conclude that they are somehow just not religious enough and so unfit to participate in the way of faith. They feel disorganized, they experience alienation, unable to comprehend their lives as connected narratives that have meaning and make sense until they meet you and they hear your story and how you were over here and God came in and did a work and now this is who you are. And when they hear your story for the first time, many people will suddenly think, maybe, just maybe, I could have a story that matters too. Maybe I matter to God. And they become connected to His greater story. You have a purpose in this generation. I have a purpose in this generation. If we will commit our ways to the Lord, if we will be faithful, and if we will choose to share our story, we can have impact, eternal impact, in everyday life, and we will have shared, and we will have achieved the purpose that we are to serve in our generation. So thank you for listening to my story.
Well, if you guys will join me, thank you, Steve, for being here. And if you guys will join me in prayer for him and for us. God, I thank you for Steve. I thank you for his words today, God. Thank you for bringing him to St. Cloud, Minnesota. God, I thank you for the work that he does over at the VA, God. And I pray that you would move there in mighty ways, God. That many people would know you through Steve and through all the Christians that are there, God. God, I thank you for this place, for this building, for these people, God. Thank you for the gifts that you have given to Westwood Church through the lives of the people in it. And God, I pray that you would use us in the community and beyond, God, to point people to you, to know you and to make you known, God. That's our heart cry. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.